Welcome to part 2 of our two-part series on the Korean War. The joint occupation of the Korean Peninsula after taking it from the Japanese in the Second World War was in a tense situation. The North, occupied by the Soviet Union, and the South, occupied by the United States, had very different ideas of what Korea was going to look like going forward. Because of a disputed election in 1948 and the appearance that Korea was a low priority for the US, the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, believed he could launch a successful invasion of South Korea. With the blessing and backing of the Soviets and Chinese, that's precisely what he did. It was initially a one-sided conflict, with the South Korean military quickly pushed back by the North Koreans. The US and the United Nations, in its first major test as an organization, rallied a defense force for South Korea. Right when the South Koreans were at their lowest point, the effects of their new allies began to bite in. The UN forces began to push back the North Koreans, eventually liberating South Korea. And as we finished last episode, the UN decided to push past the 38th parallel into North Korea to make this a victory for the South. And now for the conclusion. I'm your host David, and this is the Cold War. On the 27th of September 1950, US General Douglas MacArthur, the head of the United Nations operation in Korea, received a memorandum saying he could push north past the 38th parallel if there were no signs of Chinese or Soviet soldiers. 3 days later, he received a classified document giving him permission to go north. His orders were to unify the peninsula under the control of the South Korean president Syngman Rhee. That same day, however, China warned the United States that it would get involved if they moved north of the 38th parallel. Meanwhile, South Korea was restructuring under Rhee. Part of this was the widespread massacre of anyone suspected of working in sympathy with North Korea. Regardless of this, to increase Rhee's power, the UN forces began to cross the 38th parallel and push the North Koreans north into North Korea. I wonder how many more times I can say north in one sentence. So, in our previous episode, as I'm positive you remember, we mentioned that in preparation for the war, the Chinese moved their soldiers closer to the Korean border. From the day of the invasion north past the 38th parallel, frantic diplomatic cables between Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and Chinese Chairman Mao discussed sending Chinese divisions across the border to help the North Koreans. It was apparent, though, that in the interests of global security, Stalin could not commit any of his own troops, as that would push this into World War III territory. They did manage to convince Stalin to provide ammunition and supplies, however. It took some convincing of the Chinese military, but they were able to make the case that if the US got to the Chinese border, they might invade. And to be honest, if Truman had liked MacArthur just a little bit more, they very well might have. As the campaign north progressed, MacArthur met with President Truman in a famous meeting at Wake Island on the 15th of October 1950. MacArthur made the case to Truman that there was little chance the Chinese would intervene to help North Korea. He figured that the moment had passed for them to make such a move. Truman decided to trust MacArthur's judgment. The October campaign came with a demand for unconditional surrender. South Korean forces led the invasion, taking the North Korean capital of Pyongyang 19 days into that campaign. By November, it looked really good for the UN. They had hundreds of thousands of North Korean prisoners of war and were almost at the Chinese border. It seemed as if the North Koreans had collapsed entirely and that this was merely a matter of cleaning up. MacArthur was feeling so good about it, he even suggested invading China to destroy North Korean supply depots there. Truman stopped him on that one. The day Pyongyang fell, Chinese soldiers began to cross the border into Korea. Their first attack occurred on the 25th of October, close to the border. When the rubber hit the road, Stalin decided to help out after all, committing the Soviet Air Force to provide air support to the Chinese army. Of course, these Soviet air units were not there officially, and they flew their MiG-15 fighters with North Korean markings from Chinese air bases near that North Korean border, an area that soon became known as MiG Alley. South Korean troops took a massive hit from this new offensive. On the 1st of November, the US and Chinese forces clashed in a surprise attack, forcing a UN retreat. So I just want to pause for 1 second because this is quite a unique, brief moment in Cold War history. We often hear about, and will certainly be spending a lot of time talking about proxy wars and skirmishes, but this is about as close as we get in the Cold War to being an actual war with Americans and Soviets shooting at each other directly. It's only Soviet air support, but it's quite the moment. The involvement of the Soviet Air Force saw the world's first large-scale jet versus jet combat between MiG-15 and F-86 jets. After the success of the attack, the Chinese retreated into the mountains. This move convinced the Americans that this was an unofficial, off-the-books type of thing, not a Chinese declaration in the war. The UN continued their advance, but the Chinese were merely waiting to time a second offensive. Another round of successful battles for the Chinese took place, forcing the UN to retreat to the 38th parallel. On New Year's Eve, there was the third offensive, where a surprise attack using gongs and trumpets pushed the UN back far enough that the Chinese and North Koreans were able to retake Seoul. The situation was desperate enough that MacArthur considered the use of nuclear weapons to turn the tide of battle. The UN declared China an aggressor and called for their leaving of Korea. It wasn't until the all-or-nothing battle at Cheopyeong-ni that the UN forces were able to turn the tide of the war back in their favor. Mao bargained with Stalin for more air support. Still, at this point in the war, the Chinese and North Koreans had a lot of issues with air superiority, which interrupted their supply lines and made equipment and ammunition hard to come by. The situation was still a massive mess. For claiming the Chinese were not going to join the war, threatening China with nuclear devastation, wanting to expand this into a world war, and not listening to the president, MacArthur was subsequently sacked. The US was getting more concerned about this war dragging on and the resource costs involved with it. The new Supreme Commander would be General Matthew Ridgway, Old Iron Tits, a veteran commander of the European theater during World War II. He ordered more and more attacks to wear down the resources of the Chinese and North Koreans. There were communist attempts to man another significant offensive against the UN forces, but it was punitively costly, losing 10 times more troops than the UN in their effort. Between attacks and counterattacks, the fighting didn't move much past the 38th parallel. It slowed into a stalemate, which would continue for another 2 years. Armistice talks began in July of 1951, with the war continuing over the months to try and force a better deal for each side. However, UN bombing campaigns and an overstretched supply line put the Chinese and North Koreans in a really dire situation. Not much moved. However, the sticking point of the armistice was what to do about POWs. The Chinese and North Koreans wanted their POWs back, and many of them didn't want to go. Then, in 1952, a new player came to the table. Harry Truman left the presidency and was replaced by the great Cold Warrior himself, Dwight D. Eisenhower. You'll be hearing a lot about him on this channel, but it might be high time we change this picture over here. Anyway, he went to Korea and worked with the Chinese, Koreans, and UN to end the war. A peace agreement was signed by North Korea, China, and the UN, but Syngman Rhee refused to sign it. Anyways, Rhee's refusal to sign the treaty, and there being no peace treaty as a consequence, meant that as of today, the Korean War is technically still going. The agreement was to establish this border with a demilitarized zone separating North and South Korea. Both countries still maintain a massive military presence here, and it's one of the most heavily defended borders on Earth, though now it's a bit of a tourist attraction. One other interesting side effect is that the DMZ has actually become something of a nature preserve. Many endangered species, like a rare type of Siberian tiger, are thriving where humans, for political reasons, can't go. There's an attempt by several parties, with North Korea notably not cooperating, to turn the DMZ into a nature preserve. And, well, that's sort of where we are today. A North Korean and a South Korean force occupies the border, as well as a UN-sponsored neutral force of the world's neutraliest countries, Switzerland and Sweden. The DMZ is littered with landmines, posts, and walls. Kim Il-sung did try to reignite the Korean War in the 1970s, but China refused to help, and so the plan was scrapped. Every few years, diplomatic flare-ups occur. However, the border still stands at the 38th parallel, and Korea still remains divided long after the Cold War's end. Hopefully, some future generation will find a path to putting the countries back together. Talks and advances on this are still happening as of 2018. We hope you've enjoyed this two-part series on the Korean War. For more details on the military conduct of the Forgotten War, don't forget that our sister channel, Kings and Generals, has done a multi-part series on just this aspect. As for the Cold War, please be sure to subscribe and press the bell button so you don't miss my handsome face. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. And of course, none of this around me is free. In fact, it's actually quite expensive, so consider supporting us on Patreon via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.